Welcome back to the kitchen. Today we are doing a most requested video. We are making a sourdough bread. Some of the basic things we're going to be covering today is what a sourdough starter is, how you can get one started, the care and maintenance of a sourdough starter, and of course making a sourdough bread. So maybe you like sourdough bread or maybe you don't, but I think we all have a pretty clear understanding of what sourdough bread is. It's that bread that has a nice crunch and has lots of air bubbles on the inside and a really tangy flavor. With that being said, you may wonder what sourdough actually is. And sourdough in a simple terms is wild yeast and bacteria that convert sugars into alcohol and acid. When we're thinking of fermented foods, there's a lot to name, right? We've got pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, wine, beer, all of those. Those are all done by the process of fermentation. I hope by the end of this video to have convinced you to want to make a sourdough loaf, because sourdough is totally magic. It's water and flour and you get this amazing product from it. Let's go ahead and talk about the most important ingredient with sourdough bread, and it is your sourdough starter. So when you're looking up a sourdough recipe, you're probably going to see sourdough starter or maybe even the term Levain used, which is also starter. This is our starter that Eric and I made about a year and a half ago, and we made it from scratch. I will go ahead and include the link in the description, which is the instructions how we made it. It takes about a week to get an active starter, but here's the key. It actually takes a lot longer to get a very flavorful starter. A few other options are buying a dry starter that you can have mailed to you or you can pick up at a store, or if you have a friend or a family member, they can actually divide this starter and give you some of it to share right away. I recommend that option the most because you will get a really incredible flavor right off the bat for your breads. At the end of this video, I'm going to talk about care of a starter, feeding it, maintaining it, and what you can do if you need a vacation from your starter too. But we want to get started on the loaf, so I have to review a few terms first. The first term I find useful to know is ferment. And there are three different ways that fermentation occurs. The first one is lactobacillus, which is a bacteria, converts sugar into lactic acid. So that is one way things ferment. The other way is alcohol fermentation. And that's where yeast ferments sugars or starches and turns it into an alcohol. Lastly, there's acetobacter, turns alcohol into vinegar. The first two types of fermentation is how sourdough is made. When we're making the bread, I'm going to be talking a little bit about gluten or protein chains that are formed during this process. Gluten is formed by two proteins that are found in the endosperm of wheat. And gluten is responsible for giving bread that really chewy texture. It's also what forms that web and makes it so you can get those nice bubbles in your bread. Two more terms that are going to be helpful for today is extensibility and elasticity. Elasticity means the ability for something to hold its shape, and extensibility pretty much means the opposite. It's basically the ability for the dough to extend or stretch. Another term that's relevant is hydration. And really what that means is the flour's ability to absorb water. The hydration of the bread is important because it directly affects the elasticity or the extensibility. So without further delay, we are going to get started on our first step. So this is our sourdough starter, and I fed it last night. So it has not been recently fed. I did that intentionally because I wanted to show you guys what it looks like. So if you take a close-up look, you'll see it's very bubbly. There is a demarcation on this mason jar. So what's happened was when we fed our sourdough starter, it rose to a certain level and then it fell down lower. So I'm going to be taking half of the volume of this jar and putting it in a mixing bowl. Now we're going to add water and flour to this to make our Levain or our active starter. I'm going to be using 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour. I'm going to go ahead and mix that up first, and then we'll add 100 grams of flour. I like to use multiple types of flour for our sourdough. I love using wheat. I love using a white unbleached flour, and I also really recommend using a bread flour. Bread flour gives it a much more chewy and crunchy texture. Today I'm just going to be using white flour and bread flour. I'm going to be putting this in this mixture. I'm going to go ahead and set this aside by the wood stove until it gets bubbly. I did use warm water when making this mixture, so hopefully it happens sooner than later. We're back with our Levain and it is totally ready. It's nice and bubbly. We're going to be adding 200 grams of water and 300 grams of flour. It's a blend of the bread flour and the all-purpose white flour. I'm going to start with the water first. And this next phase that we are going into is called the autolyse, and it is one of the most important steps of sourdough bread making. Autolyse is basically when the water and flour combine and that flour is able to hydrate. Let's add in our flour. And so what's so important about this stage is that enzymes come in to do some work. The first enzyme breaks down gluten bonds, and the second one helps turn the starches in this flour into sugars for the yeast to feast on. This stage is really important for the protein to break down. That's going to increase the extensibility of the dough, therefore making it easier for us to work with. At this point, some people add in salt to their recipe. I'm going to wait on the salt, and the reason is because the salt is a little bit counterintuitive to what we're trying to achieve right now. What the salt will do is actually strengthen the gluten, and we're working on breaking it down. We now need to let this dough sit for 30 minutes to an hour. I'm going to put it back by the wood stove. All right, it's been a little bit under an hour and we are ready for our final mixing. We're going to be adding in 200 grams of warm water with 1 tablespoon of kosher salt. And I'm just kind of winging this one. And I like to mix that in first. At this point, it helps to use your hands just a little bit. And then we're going to add more flour in. And that was 300 grams of, again, a mixture of bread flour and white flour. So even though this is pretty messy, I prefer to do it with my hands because then I get a good idea of how the dough is coming together and I don't accidentally add too much water. This is the consistency. I'm going to leave the dough for now and we're going to get it back by the wood stove for half an hour, and then we're going to be doing our series of folding or stretching the dough. It's been half an hour that our dough's been resting, and what we're going to do is our folding. So we're going to grab the dough and just stretch it over itself. I'm going to rotate the bowl and continue to do the same thing. I'm just going to repeat this 4 times. Just like that. I'm going to put this back by the wood stove, and I do have to do the same process every half an hour for the next 2.5 hours. So we're going to be doing it a total of 6 times. By repeating these folds, we are organizing those long gluten chains and forming a tighter web. So we are increasing the elasticity of the dough. During this bulk fermentation or first rise phase, we also have carbon dioxide and alcohol that's being produced by yeast. And that's where those air bubbles that we're familiar with in sourdough come from. And at the same time, there are sugars that are converted to lactic acid and acetic acid, which give bread that sour, distinctive flavor. Now that the dough has risen about 1.5 times, we're going to shape it. What we're going to do is grab a corner and put it in towards the inside and then be flipping the dough on the other side. And then we're going to create some tension by cupping around the edges. There we go. That's perfect. So we have 2 different options. We can let this rest for half an hour and then go ahead and bake the bread today. But what we're going to be doing is putting this in the refrigerator or our cooler for 12 hours. And what that does is it slows down the fermentation and gives the bread a really nice flavor. I'm just going to flour a bowl and put this dough in there. And we'll get this in the fridge. Okay, so it has been 12 hours and this is what our bread looks like. It looks pretty much the same, maybe a little poofier. What we're going to do now is bake the bread. So we're going to preheat our oven to 450, and we're going to be cooking this bread in our Dutch oven. That is our favorite way to cook it. It keeps moisture trapped inside, so this bread will expand at an even rate. And then near the end of the cooking process, we actually take the lid off so it gets a really nice golden crust. We've got about 20 minutes where we're going to let this bread heat up to room temperature, and we're going to be putting the Dutch oven in our oven to heat up ahead of time. While we're waiting for our Dutch oven to heat up in the oven at 450, I wanted to go over some considerations of sourdough bread and talk about some of the troubleshooting if you're not getting a great loaf. So you may have already guessed it, there are lots of things that are influencing the bread, all the way down to the flour, air temperature, the water quality you're using, how you're mixing the dough, and of course your sourdough starter. Is your sourdough starter really active? All of those factors are really important and can have a pretty big impact on your bread. And I know that can seem kind of overwhelming. You can have a bread that's overproofed, underproofed, overhydrated, too little of hydration. But through our experience, I've found two of those things are most important. And the first is definitely you want an active sourdough starter. So what this means is you really need to have it bubbly, and it's even better if you have one that is really strong and you've maybe fed it 2 days in a row, so you know it's reliably bubbling up. If you're not getting a good rise, that's where I would always start. Sometimes that is the issue. Another thing that's crucial is air temperature. And so that one's a little bit tricky for us because we have a wood stove. So things can get cold in here, then they can get hot. And for bread like this, you really want a constant 75 degrees or warmer. With that being said, sometimes if you have this process at a very high temperature, the fermenting will happen very quickly and you won't get a lot of those awesome flavors. So sometimes it is nice to have things a little bit cooler. That's actually why we put this in the refrigerator or a cooler. We wanted to develop some more of the flavors, but in general, that's key. You want to keep that room temperature at about 70 to 75 degrees. I'm pretty happy with the way this particular loaf turned out. We tend to add too much water and they spread out. They're usually a higher hydration. This one you can tell is holding its form, which is easier for me to work with, so I'm happy with that. And it did form those really nice bubbles when it was rising. But another major factor that I don't always do is weighing my ingredients. Weighing your ingredients makes a tremendous difference, and I think that's what happened with this bread. If you're not weighing your ingredients and you're just going by volume, that's not very accurate. And that's because different flours are different, not just in quality, but their protein level. So a wheat flour can quite literally weigh twice as much as a white flour, which would mean that you should go by weight and not volume. Anytime you're having issues with getting a good loaf, I would also recommend making sure that you are really paying attention to your measurements. Our Dutch oven is ready and it's very hot. We like to put some cornmeal down at the bottom of the pan just in case there's any sticking. And then we're going to go ahead and try and get this dough out of the bowl. So you can reshape it at this point, but I like not to because that will leave more of those air bubbles in there. Whew. I don't have the correct tool for it, but we use this little processing knife and it works very well. And we're just going to do one cut, about 1/2 inch deep. That's going to cook for 20 minutes with the lid and for 30 minutes with the lid off. One thing I wanted to go over is care of a sourdough starter and maintaining it. This is how we keep our sourdough starter. It's just in a mason jar with a cheesecloth doubled up on top. So I stole out of this starter yesterday and I didn't feed it. And that's because I wanted to show you guys what is forming on top, which is called hooch. And it's a layer of liquid. And that's a sign that our culture needs to be fed. So they have exhausted their resources. And that's because I neglected them. So having a starter is much like owning a pet on a simple level. You want to feed it at least once a day. That's a pretty good rule. And that's what I use if you want it to be active. So we're going to get to that in just a second. So what I'm going to do is stir in that hooch. And we're going to pour out half of it. And half of it is going to become what we call discarded starter. So that step is crucial. You have to separate that, and that is where you could give a gift to a friend if you wanted to make a new sourdough starter. But what we're going to be doing is now feeding our current starter. It's very simple. You just put in the same ratio of water and flour to however much starter there is. So I'm not going to get too mathematical on this one. I'm going to add about 1/3 of a cup of flour and Same for the water, but with the water, I like to start mixing it in and see how thick I want it. And that's what we're ending with. It's still a little bit chunky, but it's about pancake batter consistency, maybe a little bit thinner. And this is ready to go for another 24 hours before it will need to be fed again. So you may be thinking, what do you do with discarded sourdough starter? Well, there's lots of options. We generally compost it. We have given it to our chickens or our animals. Another way we commonly use it is in other recipes. You can use this in pizza crust. You can use it for waffles, pancakes. You can even just go ahead and use this for your next bread. So it just depends on how you want to use it. But again, composting is one of our main ways that we use it. If you remember when I first pulled from the starter yesterday, when you would want to feed a starter is when they start to look not as bubbly. So when they rise, they're at their most active point, and then it'll start to decrease from there. You really would want to feed it at that time. But again, for this video, I just wanted to wait to show you guys what happens, which is the hooch. So let's talk about that. What if you want to go on vacation? Or what if you're not home to feed your sourdough starter every day? Well, if you remember before, fermentation works best with heat. So we do have the option to slow this process down significantly by putting it in a frigerator. Generally, it's not advised to do that for long periods. And what I mean by that is more than a few weeks. You'd want to take it out, give it some new food, let it bubble back up, and then again put it back in storage. We've done it for as long as 6 weeks and we were totally fine. So you have that option if you're flying through too much flour and you maybe don't want to make a sourdough bread all the time. A lot of folks will store it in the fridge for the week and they'll just pull it out for the weekend and get some loaves made. And lastly, the volume that I have is about 1 cup. Lots of people have really big jars, and for me, that's more to feed, that's more cost, more flour. So if I know that I want to make something and I have an active starter, I can just prepare a few days in advance and get my flour and water ready. And that's why I keep this pretty small. We're going to go ahead and get this put away. And we just store this on our counter at room temperature. I believe it's been 20 minutes, so we are going to get the lid off of our Dutch oven. We just checked our bread and it is done, so we're gonna pull it out. Ooh, it's gorgeous. Beautiful loaf. I don't think we could have asked for a better loaf, so I'm really happy with this. We're gonna let it cool down in there just a little bit, and we are going to wait for the bread to cool entirely before we cut into it. That's crucial with sourdough bread. You can cut into it right away, but if you do, you may get a little bit of a gummy texture. So you can see now why the slow fermentation gives you such an awesome bread. And I wanted to take a moment just to talk about the difference between commercial yeast and wild yeast or a sourdough starter. When Eric and I first got into bread making a few years back, we just started with commercial yeast. And I highly encourage that. If you're new to bread making, there's a few benefits to that, and one is the time. So it's very quick and it's very reliable. You're gonna get breads that are gonna turn out the same every time if you do the same thing. Whereas sourdough is really influenced by minor factors like we mentioned earlier. So I'm a big fan of commercial yeast, but because sourdough is more economic for us, we have switched everything over to sourdough. We just use our sourdough starter for pretty much any bread product that we're doing that you would use yeast in. And it's not always comparable if you use sourdough, but we have learned how to make it work for us. So with sourdough, not only do you get that awesome flavor, but it's actually a healthier, more nutritious bread. And the reason for that is because of the fermentation process itself. Enzymes make the gluten more digestible and some of the minerals and vitamins more readily available to us. So we're getting more nutrition from a bread like this. Some folks who have gluten sensitivities can even eat a bread like this because of that fermentation. In the video description, we are going to be including some links that we have found helpful for us. And if you get a chance to take a look at them, you may find that people make sourdough bread in all sorts of different ways. I think it's really important that you don't let any sort of math, terminology, or the science behind it, stop you from trying, because it really is as simple thing as flour and water combining to make this. And yes, it is a skill and there's quite a bit more to it. So I know there can be a lot of confusion behind it, but in our minds, there's no better way than to try. We have been making bread for a few years and it takes a while to learn, but that's just it. You have to learn to understand it. Another thing you may see is some of the equipment you can have for bread making, and although I do recommend a Dutch oven, we've been making breads without proofing baskets, without the scraper, and without, the correct knife or blade. So you really don't actually need that stuff to get a good sourdough loaf. So with that being said, I hope that you will be encouraged to get started and make a sourdough loaf. We're gonna go ahead and get this loaf cut open.